Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for listening. Oh, it sounds like there's a very strong sound there in the hall. This work, what I want to do today is basically to present an instrument, which is a preliminary one that we've devised, and show you some preliminary results from that instrument. So it's motivated by the replication crisis and all the kind of concerns that Brian Nosek was speaking about this morning. And the problem is, of course, that if we want to assess research quality as such, and even then assess the assessment of such quality, it is, of course, not objectively measurable. I like personally this kind of definition, that high scientific quality is that which efficiently produces knowledge. You may have your favorite definition, but the problem is, of course, that we can't measure it directly. So we have to go to those who actually do this evaluation. And to be fair, it's probably the case that even experienced reviewers do not always know exactly why they make the evaluations they do. So to get to this in a systematic fashion, in order to achieve these goals of being able to compare, for example, different bodies of research and different types of reviewers, we devised a broad instrument. This is a broad overview of the instrument. You can see that there are 38 items here. Most of them are Likert scale items that are rated on a 5-point scale on how much you agree or do not agree with the statement. And of course, you can't see the statements here. This is just a label for each item that you see on the screen right now. But in bold, we see first here that there is this review item, which is essentially that I would recommend to accept this for publication. And to the interesting point about researchers' reputation that somebody just had a question about, I would say that this item would probably be more influenced by eminent researchers, by the halo effect of being such a eminent researcher, and that is why we included an overall impression item here to the right, number 38, which is just a scale on how good is this study as such. And that is probably less influenced by that, because here you can be pretty sure that it's probably solid work if it's a well-known researcher that has done solid work before. I want to give you an overview of the kinds of items that we have devised in this instrument. What I have shown on the screen here in the boxes is something we call scope items. And so we see here on the top, number one, it's group size. That's typically the sample in social sciences research. It will be a sample of people, but it could be a sample of whatever units of analysis, of course. Then we have how the scope into the past time, and the scope into the future of time, geographical scope, and here is the population to which the study can be believed to generalize. So let's take a quick look at these, number 3 and 4, just to give you an impression of what they look like. So what is the scope of this study in terms of being applicable or relevant at different times into the future? And we have a geometric scale here from a few years up to tens of thousands of years, and for all the remaining time of humankind. And for the geographical issue, what's the scope of this study in terms of being applicable to different geographical regions? It starts with the local community of this study, the specific school or workplace or whatever that community is. All similar communities, regions smaller than a country, and you see that it continues up to the whole globe. We can also note that the I have grayed out the items that are not typically specifically called for in a review, but the ones that you can see more clearly here from number 8 to 15, these are the kinds of items that are usually found in instructions to reviewers. So we have looked through instructions for reviewers from about 20 different journals and drawn these kinds of items from that. We were inspired by those kinds of items, you would say. So I think you all recognize what these kinds of items are, and I don't have to go into them specifically. Then we can see that there are a few other ones that are, oh yes, I just want to give you an example of how these are formulated. So this would be the writing, number 8 here. The writing is clear, accessible, and to the point, and then you answer from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Number 9 would be concepts and constructs are clear and well defined. And number 10 would be the study contributes something new, whether a new problem, approach, data, or theory or explanation. Now let's look at some of the less common types of items: theory, empirics, and claims testable. They look like this. So there is a clear connection between theory and empirics, and such that the data logically correspond to what is being claimed, hypothesized, or tested. And number 6 is it would be possible to test the claims, etc., regardless of whether it was actually done. And number 7 is like number 6, although it was actually done in this study. And the reason we included these items is that we have experienced that from our own review work, that this is not always the case, that there's a good correspondence between the questions that are asked or the overall research questions, and the design doesn't always match very well to the aims of the goal. So now to the actual testing. We drew a sample from a pool of 12,000 articles that we had already collected in a previous study. These happen to be concerned with sex and gender, so they were searched on those keywords. And then we needed to have some kind of group categorization to make some sort of comparison on which to test the items. And in this case, we chose the categories that these articles applied a gender studies perspective. We don't need to go into what that is for the sake of just testing this instrument. But the idea is simply that in some studies, this perspective is clearly declared. In some studies, it is not, but you can infer it. This is the less condition here. We can infer that the authors are applying such a perspective. And then we can also see that there are studies that do not apply this perspective at all, but maybe studying, for example, sex differences from a biological or medical perspective, for example. Then we asked 15 academics to rate these articles, and this is a huge task. Rating all the 38 items for all 60 articles took these people about a week. The reliability was pretty high, inter-rater reliability, so that's good. So, because there are so many items, I will only present the results of a factor analysis that we performed on all the 33 quantitative items. So we left out the 3 qualitative ones. And judging from the factor structure, we think that we could identify these 3 dimensions. One that we could reasonably call logic and clarity, for example, from the item with a high loading in the item, that there's a clear connection between theory and empirics. Another dimension was causality, because there were several items that asked about causal relations. The first dimension accounted for most of the data. You see it in yellow here, almost 50%. The logic and clarity, about 13% of the variance. And finally, there was the scope variable or dimension, which is not surprising as we had several items referring to scope. And that also accounted for about 13%, which means that we could not account for 28% of the variance. When plotting the factor scores of these three dimensions, the dimensions you see here in blue, red, and green, we can see that the self-identified gender studies articles were rated slightly lower. And this was also true of the inferred gender studies articles, which in some way attests to the correctness of them inferring this kind of perspective on these articles. Whereas the ones that did not apply a gender perspective had substantially higher ratings, mostly so for logic and clarity, and you see in which direction the results go. These are quite large effect sizes, I would say, 0.62, 0.44, and 0.35. So this is just one example of how we could use this kind of instrument. What I did not mention, for example, is items that the items that are qualitative, like study design, for example, where we have 12 different alternatives characterizing a study as experimental or quasi-experimental or correlational, or a literature review, etc., etc. But those kind of data were not used in this study. So what the instrument then does, to summarize a bit, is that it can quantify many different indices of scientific quality. Of course, this is just one way of designing an instrument like this, but it seems to make some level of sense. It has high inter-rater reliability as tested upon these 15 participants. The correlation structure points to high convergent validity. And also the structure also points to a good phase validity. And because there are so many items, it is possible to identify many different dimensions in the rating data. We could just as well have used each item separately or only a few of them. And being able to look at dimensions in the data also makes it possible to perhaps categorize different research designs or different types and sources of data. But we didn't use that in this analysis. So we mean that this instrument could be used for two main purposes. The first is to assess the accuracy of raters in terms of, as we said, their reliability. We could also compare their performance in relation to some sort of criterion to assess their criterion validity. So it is not other things than what we want them to assess that they do actually assess. And by assessing raters, we could, of course, also compare different groups of raters if that is of interest. For example, professional reviewers compared to non-experts, experts, even undergraduates. Maybe they have a very good sense of scientific quality. We don't know. It can be explored. The other main thing we can do is to assess and compare different bodies of research in terms of their absolute level of quality, in terms of the dimensions of quality that they sort of vary in terms of, again, of course, as assessed by raters, the raters in question. So with this toolbox, we can compare, for example, disciplines. We can compare research institutions, universities. We could compare different journals, subfields, etc., etc. We can also make comparisons across time by comparing studies that are published maybe 30 or 40 years back in time. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. I think Guy didn't hear me that he went over time, so we'll have just a little bit less time for questions. So questions are coming. Shelley in the back.
Hello, Dr. Madison. My name is Shelley Brownage from the University of Split School of Medicine. And your study used the scientific quality instrument. In a 2020 study, I used the RQI. We can't hear enough about the RQI today to evaluate review quality of peer review reports. And the items, your 38 items kind of remind me of the similar questions that are on the RQI. In particular, some of the questions are actually compound questions. And we found in our study, it was actually hard to rate some of the reviews using the RQI that contained compound questions, particularly item 17, where what if one of the criteria, one criterion is present, but the other criteria aren't. How did your raters, how did your scholars find rating the papers with these compound questions? Did they have to break them up, make notes about how it was hard to do that? How did they proceed with that?
So sorry, are you saying that our item 17 was compound?
Yes, the paper is logically organized, easy to follow,
yes.
and easy to search for particular information. What if one of those criterion are met, but not all of them?
Yes, I agree. That could be a weakness. Certainly, we did ask them, of course, how they felt about using the instrument, and we didn't have any complaints of that kind, really. But it's a very good point. Yes, we'll think about that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we have a question here and then from the virtual.
Hi, Nihar Shah from Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you for your presentation. So a couple of years back in a computer science venue, we had done a study asking different questions, but there also we had looked at the mapping between individual criteria and overall recommendations, etc. And there we had used non-linear models. So I guess the factor analysis uses linear models. And in an exploratory study, we tried to see, hey, what if we had used linear models? And what we found is that linear models may not have given a reasonable fit to the data. So
really?
We found that, hey, we should use non-linear models, not linear models. So I was wondering if you had looked at these questions about linear or non-linear models.
We haven't actually, and I am very thankful for that point of view. Could you perhaps in the chat give me some citations?
Yes, so I'll follow up over email.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Michael with the virtual question, then we have time only for one question after Michael.
Yes, hi, Sarah Schroeder from the BMJ asks if you tested intra-rater reliability and if any of your initial items didn't load on a factor and was ultimately removed.
No, they all loaded highly, actually, yes.
And did you test intra-rater reliability?
Yes, it was the numbers you saw, between 0.75 and 0.80, something like that.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. And last question over there.
As far as my understanding goes on this analysis, let me see if I understood. Logic and clarity was the first dimension, scope was the second, and causality was the third, according to the R square that you showed.
Yes.
Why didn't you include more dimensions, more factors?
It is because the factor structure did not fall out well in the sense that the fourth or fifth factor could be given a clear interpretation.
And what was the one that correlated more with overall impression?
It was the biggest one, the logic and clarity. And this was after rotation, of course. And I think the reason for this is that we compared groups of studies that were quite different. It would have been if we had used a more homogeneous pool of articles, I believe we would have found more dimensions that could be interpreted.
Yeah.
But in this
Thank-
case, there was such large differences that you could see from the effect sizes that kind of they took over the variability.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. We